Okay, so this is going to be a quick video on making a stopwatch in JavaScript. So this is what the finished product is kind of going to look like. We can do all the things you'd expect. You can start, stop. If you press start again, it'll continue from this current time. And then reset will set it back to 0. You can start from the beginning. So nothing too fancy, but I'm going to be going over some pretty important concepts in JavaScript, including constructor functions and closures. So what we're basically going to be doing to make this stopwatch work is we're going to be using date.now. So date.now is a method on the date object that lets us, so if we print date.now, what happens is it returns the current date and time in milliseconds. So obviously on its own, we can't do much with this huge number. But let's say we did something like var now equals date.now and wait a few seconds. And then we do var later equals date.now. So now if we do later minus now, it'll return how many milliseconds have passed between later and now. So in this case, 9,060 milliseconds have passed, in other words, 9 seconds. So we're basically going to be using this kind of concept to constantly add time to the stopwatch. So we're going to keep calculating how much time has passed and keep adding it onto the stopwatch. And we're going to be using an interval to keep doing that. And that's basically how the stopwatch is going to work. So I'll just go right into it. I'll exit out of this and go to my terminal. So I'll go to my desktop and make a folder called Stopwatch. So in this stopwatch folder, we're going to make a few things. So we're going to need the main index.html file. And then we'll need folders for CSS and JavaScript. So I'll make a CSS folder and a JS folder. Okay, now I'll just open all of that in our text editor. So this is what your folder structure should look like. So your CSS and JavaScript are going to be empty at first, but we're going to be focusing on the HTML for now, and we'll get right back to that. So open up your HTML. I'm going to start off with a basic template, so just have the head and the body. I'll make the title Stopwatch. So if you remember, the example only had a few elements on it. It had that main timer and it had 2 buttons. So that timer, we're going to be using an h1 tag. We'll give an ID of timer, and we'll start it off at 0. Okay, and now for the 2 buttons, the first button was the one that switched between start and stop. So we'll give it an ID of toggle, and we'll initialize it to start. And then the second button will be for resetting, so we'll get an ID of reset and call it reset. And that's all we need for now, so we can open this up in the browser. And this is what it looks like right now. So I'm going to be applying some minimal CSS to it, not too much. I want to focus mostly on the JavaScript, but I'll just make it look a bit nicer. Feel free to spend more time on yours to make it look nicer than mine. So I'll just call it style.css. And before you start working on CSS or JavaScript files, you want to make sure that you load it properly into your HTML file first. So we can load the CSS by using the link tag and then giving the path to that CSS file. So in this case, it's css/style.css. And now let's test to make sure that it's loaded properly. So we'll do something like making the body and give it a background color of black. Okay, so it did become black, so we know that this file is connected properly to this HTML, so let's get rid of that. And so what we want to do is kind of center this and then like center it vertically as well. So to center horizontally, we can just do text line center, which will center it horizontally. Now let's push it down a bit so it'll be vertically centered as well. I'll just do margin top of 200. Okay, and now we want to make this timer, make the font look a bit better and make it a lot bigger. So we can do that. We can select it by using the ID of timer. And so we'll make the font family, I'll use Lato. We'll make the font size really big. So just pick some really big number. I'll do 100 pixels. And I'll make the font weight 300, so it won't be as bold. Okay, so that looks pretty nice in my opinion. And so now we just need to style these buttons. So for the button, we'll just give it a width of 100 and a height of 35. Okay, and we're pretty much done. I'm just going to do something so that when we hover over the buttons, the cursor changes to a pointer, because right now it doesn't do anything, so you can't like really tell that it's clickable. So button hover, make the cursor a pointer. Okay, so now it does work. And that's all the CSS I'm going to be doing. So I'll exit out of that. Now let's get into the JavaScript files. So we're going to be having two JavaScript files in this project. The first one's going to be stopwatch.js, and the second one's going to be main.js. So stopwatch.js is where we're going to have the main logic for how our stopwatch functions and how it starts, stop, resets, all that. And then in our main.js, we're going to be using that stopwatch code to create a stopwatch object and use it for this project. The reason we want to split it into two files is so that that stopwatch.js file kind of becomes reusable, so we can use it in anywhere regardless of the project. So it's kind of its own standalone kind of code that you can use anywhere. And then our main.js is just going to be the project-specific stuff we want to do. So let's start off with that stopwatch.js file. Let's create it. And the same thing, let's load it first before we start coding. So you kind of want to put your script tags at the bottom of your body tag. This is because the DOM loads from top to bottom. So you want to make sure your HTML is loaded before you start loading in your JavaScript. There's ways around this, but for simplicity, I'm just going to put the script tag at the bottom. And I'll give it a source and give the path to the JS file. So it's js/stopwatch.js. Okay. So now let's just make sure it's loaded properly. I'll do something like console.log hi. And let's go to the browser and check. Refresh, open the console, and hi is there. So we know that the JS is connected properly to the HTML file now. So get rid of that. So what this file is going to be is literally just going to be one function that's going to construct a stopwatch object. And a function that creates an object basically is going to be called a constructor function that you use with the new operator. So just in case you're not familiar with the constructor function, it's basically a function we use to create an object. And we do that using the new operator. So we can do something like var watch equals new stopwatch. So when you use the new keyword with a function, what happens is that function implicitly creates a kind of an empty object and implicitly returns this. So what it does is basically this now when you use the new keyword. And this refers to the object, the empty object. So anything you do to this, it's going to be given to this watch. So now if we say this dot start equals function, and we'll just say, semicolon, and we'll say console.log watch is starting. So now if we do watch.start, it will print watch is starting. So anything we do to this, it's going to be given to this watch. So if we print out watch, we can see that's a stopwatch object that has a function called start. So this is how we're going to be creating the functions we use for our stopwatch. We're going to have the ability to do stuff like watch.start, watch.stop, watch.reset. So this is kind of the public stuff we want to give to the user. All of this stuff we're going to be doing in our main.js file. But the functions are going to be created in this file. So we're going to need this.start, we're going to need this.stop, we're going to need this.reset. And we'll also have one value we'll give them called this.isOn. And we'll start off at false. So this is going to be the value that lets them check if the stopwatch is currently running. And we're initializing it to false because the stopwatch starts off at off. So one thing to note is what happens if we do something like var x equals 10, and then we create a stopwatch object. So this x, because we did not prefix it with a this, it's not actually given to the object. So if we console.log watch.x, refresh, it's undefined because we didn't give it this. So anything we use var keyword with, or anything that we don't use the this keyword with, is just local to this function. And all the functions, because the way scoping works in JavaScript, these inner functions have access to these variables. But outside this function, like over here, we can't access these. But one thing to note is what happens if we do, inside this function, we do console.log x in our start function. So now if we do watch.start, what would happen? Well, so remember, this watch object does not have access to this x variable, but it does print 10. So why is that? Why can this watch print 10, even though this variable isn't part of this watch object? So if I print watch, you can see that it has is on, it has these public functions we gave it: start, stop, reset, is on, but it doesn't have this x variable, but it's still managing to print this variable x over here. So the reason this can work is because of the way lexical scoping works in JavaScript. And it's a concept called closures. So these inner functions, they have access to these outer functions, remember that. But so the thing is, if we give this watch, all we're giving this watch object are these functions right here. But since this variable is visible to this inner function, this variable actually stays alive inside this watch. So even though we can't directly access it, these functions still have access to them. So this is our way of creating private variables up here that we can give the user access to in the way that we want them to. And the reason this is so powerful is because we can create private functions and variables that will help us maintain how our stopwatch works. And then we can give them access to these values in here, but only in the way that we want. We won't let the user mutate them or anything, but we can let them have access to what the values currently are, or, and use functions inside these. So now those are the public functions we want to use. Now let's create these private variables that we'll need. So we'll start off with the time in milliseconds, which will start off at 0. And we're going to need interval, and we're going to need the offset. So I'll explain what each one of these are. The time is just going to be the current time in milliseconds, and then we're going to be formatting it later, but that's what the current time is going to be on the stopwatch. So the interval is basically what's going to happen is when we do watch.start, we're going to be setting an interval that'll keep running an update function. And we're going to save that interval that we create and start to this variable. And the reason we want to save that interval is so that we can clear it in the stop function. And the offset is what we're going to be using with date.now with in the beginning. So when we do watch.start, we're going to set offset equal to date.now, and then we're going to be using this offset to calculate how much time has passed. So that's what these private variables are for. And we're going to need a couple of private functions. So we're going to need an update function, which is what we're going to, what the interval is going to constantly keep running. We're going to need a delta function, which is going to calculate how much time has passed. And then we're going to need a time formatter function. Because remember, all of this is in milliseconds, and we don't want it to have some huge millisecond number. We kind of want it to be formatted like this. So that's what the time formatter is going to do. Okay, so this is pretty much all we're going to be needing for our stopwatch code. Get rid of this. So now let's start off with our public functions. Start off with start. So what we only want this start to run is if the timer isn't already on, because if this timer is on, we don't want to keep doing start. So we'll say if this if this is not on, then do this code. So what we'll do is we'll set an interval that'll keep running update over and over again, very fast, every 10 milliseconds. And we want to save it to this interval variable so that we can clear it in the stop function. So we'll say interval equals, and we don't want to do var interval, we just want to say interval, because if we do var interval, it'll be local to this function and won't be visible here. We want to make sure we use this variable that's visible to all of these functions. So we'll say just interval equals set interval. And we also want to get the offset to date.now. So this offset is where we're going to be using in delta to calculate how much time has passed. So this is the time when the stopwatch starts. And then we'll just say this dot is on equals true. And that's all for our start function. Now in our stop, what we're going to say if this, and we only want it to run if the stopwatch is on. So remember, we saved the interval here, so we can just clear it now in the stop function. Clear interval. I'll pass in the interval. And now we can just set that interval equal to null. And we'll say this dot is on equals false. Okay, and that's all there is to our stop function. We just clear the interval that was set by the start interval, by the start function. And reset, that's going to be the easiest. We're just going to set the time back equal to 0. Okay, so now let's start working on these private functions that do the majority of the work for us. So update is going to be the function that keeps running every 10 milliseconds. What it's going to do is constantly add the amount of time that's passed to this time. So we'll say time plus equals time passed. And the time passed is going to be calculated by this delta. So we'll just say time plus equals delta. So time, whatever return value from delta is going to be added to this time. So now let's calculate how much time's passed. So what we can do is the same thing we did in the console before, how I showed you. We'll say var now equals date.now. And the amount of time that has passed is the offset that we set minus this now. Or sorry, it's going to be the now minus the offset. So we'll say var time passed equals offset minus now. And we just return the time passed. So before we return this time passed, there's one other thing we have to do. Because the next time we want this function to run, we don't want to use this offset. We want to use now as the next offset. So we can say offset equals now. So that the next time this function is run, it'll calculate the amount of time that's passed since the last time it ran correctly. And that's all there is to delta. So technically our stopwatch is actually finished now, but it's just not going to be formatted in the way that we want. So, but just to show you that it is finished, we can just do console.log time here. And now, so if we do, so refresh, we'll say var watch equals new stopwatch. And now if we do watch.start, okay, it's going the wrong way. So let's see why that's happening. Time plus equals delta. Oh, it should be now minus offset. Okay, so now let's just do that again. Var watch equals new stopwatch. Now if we do watch.start, so we can see, so basically this number all the way at the left, that's the amount of seconds have passed, and then these three numbers are the milliseconds. So this is basically our stopwatch. It's working. It's just not formatted in this way that we want it to be. So that's what we're going to be using for a time formatter function. So instead of console.logging the time, what we're going to do is var formatted time equals time formatter, and then we'll pass in the time. So it'll take in the time in milliseconds, and then it'll format it. So instead of console.logging time, we're just going to console.log the formatted time. Now obviously we're going to be doing it on this at the end, not in the console, but until we get the format right, let's just stick to the console. Let me stop it here. Okay. So now in our time formatter function, we're going to be creating a date object and passing in this value. So we can say var time equals new date time in milliseconds. And remember, functions, the way scoping works is this time variable is going to be different than this time variable. So if we do something like time equals 5 here, it won't be affecting this because this function, when we do time equals 5, it'll first look for the variable time inside its own function, and it does find it here. So if this wasn't here, it would look for time here, it doesn't find it, so then it would go up here and it'll see here, so this time would be set to 5. But since we did time here, it's going to be its own variable. So the reason we want to pass this into a date object is because now we'll have access to all these date methods like get milliseconds, get minutes, get seconds. It'll make it a lot easier. So we'll do var minutes equals time.getMinutes. Var seconds equals time.getSeconds. Var milliseconds equals time.getMilliseconds. Okay. So there's one issue with this code. The thing is, we want it to always have the same amount of places in each thing. We always want this to be 3, we always want this to be 2, we always want this to be 2. But if minutes are 0, we're just going to end up with something that looks like this. So minutes will just be 0. So if the time in milliseconds was something like this, so the minutes would be 0, the seconds would be 1, and then the milliseconds would be 2, 3, 4. So that would, if we format it just like that, it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And we don't want that. We want to make sure that we have a 0 in front of here and a 0 in front of here. So what we can do is if the length is less than 2, add a 0 in front of it. If the length is less than 2 for seconds also, add a 0 in front of it. And keep doing that for a millisecond until the length is 3. So let's do that now. And so the thing is, these methods, the get minutes, get seconds, get milliseconds, it returns a number. And you can't check the length of a number. So what we can do is after each one of these, we can say .toString. So we'll be able to check the length after that. ToString, ToString. So now what we can do is if minutes.length is less than 2, minutes equals 0 plus minutes. And we'll do the same thing for seconds. And for milliseconds, it's going to be a bit different because remember, milliseconds can either return one number or two digits or 3 digits. So what we'll do a while loop instead. We'll say while milliseconds.length is less than 3, milliseconds equals 0 plus milliseconds. I spelled that wrong. Milliseconds. Okay. So now at the end, we just want to return our format. So it'll be return the minutes plus a colon plus the seconds plus a dot and then plus the milliseconds. Okay. So let's just add spaces around them. Okay, now let's see if this works because we're already console.logging the formatted time. So now if we start, or sorry, we didn't create the watch object, did we? Nope. So we'll say var watch. I didn't even attach anything to this, but I don't know why I thought that would work. Equals new stopwatch. So now if we do watch.start, timer formatter is not defined. Okay, that's because I did a typo there. It should be time formatter. Okay, watch equals new stopwatch, watch.start. So now our stopwatch is working. This is exactly the format we want. We just want it to be over here instead of the console, but our watch is pretty much done now. So we'll do watch.stop. So now we're done with the stopwatch.js. Let's get rid of this console.log because we don't want it to print in the console. And now let's get started on our main.js file. So let's open up the HTML file also so that we can reference the IDs and stuff. So in our main.js, let's cache all these IDs. So we'll say the var timer equals document.getElement by ID. And the ID is timer. Var, we'll get the toggle button. Toggle button equals document.getElement by ID toggle. And same thing for the reset. Reset. Okay, so now we have the 3 elements we want to use. What we want to do is add a click listener to the toggle button. So when we click on it, run this function. That should be semicolon. Okay, so when we click on it, first we want to check if the watch is on. So if the watch is on, stop it. Otherwise, you want to start it. And then the reset button is going to be something similar. Just add a click listener to it. So we'll just reset the stopwatch when we click on the reset button. Okay, so now let's see if this works. No errors, that's good. So now let's try this out. If we press start. Okay, so nothing's happening. Let's see why. Toggle button dot add listener, click. Okay, so we're saying watch that is on and stuff, and watch the start, watch that stop, but we never created the watch object. So what we need to do is var watch equals new stopwatch. Also, the reason we didn't get any errors is because we didn't even load the main.js here. So I should probably take my own advice. Before we start working on the JavaScript, you always want to load it first. So let's create the script tag, give it a source of js/main.js. Okay, now let's see. Okay, no errors still. Hopefully, let me just console.log hi at the end to make sure it's loaded properly this time. Okay, so we do get hi, so this code is running. So now if we press start, so nothing's happening. And the reason is because, remember, we removed the console.log, but we never said that we want to do anything with this element. So how are we going to know to make this element be the formatted time? So what we can do is we can pass in this timer element to the stopwatch here. So we'll pass in the timer. So the stopwatch takes in an element, and what it'll do is it'll make the text content of that element into that into the formatted time. Okay, so now let's try this out. Refresh, no errors. So now please work, and it looks like it's working. So now if we press start again, it should stop it. And so now there's one thing we're gonna have to fix for reset, because right now if we press reset, it won't do anything. And that's because we set the time equal to 0, but we're not updating the text content. So what we need to do is run the update function after we set the time equal to 0. But remember that this update function, it adds on how much time has passed. So we don't want to add any time on if we're doing reset. So we only want to do this if the watch is on. So if this stat is on, then do time plus equals delta. Otherwise, we're just going to run this code. So now there's still going to be an issue, and I'll show you why. So now if we press stop, nothing's happening. And the reason for this is because now we're doing this is on. So what is this? So I'll just show you. Inside this console.log, we'll print this. So now if we press start, so this isn't the watch, this is window. So why is that happening? Well, the thing is when you use set interval, so when we use set interval, this changes from the watch to whatever object is calling set interval. And set interval is actually the same thing as window.setInterval. So now inside this update function, when we say this, it's going to be referring to this window. So to fix that, there's this function called bind, which lets you choose whichever this variable you want. So we'll pass in this into update. And this inside this scope, this is still referring to the watch. So when we do update.bind this, now when we do this, it should print out the watch instead. So it's printing out the stopwatch now, and it's working now. So now let's just make sure, let me get rid of this console.log. Okay, so start, and pressing again should stop it. And now reset should set it back to 0. Okay, awesome. So there's still a couple of things we need to do. So when we press the start button, we want this start to change back to stop. And when we press it again, we want it to say start again. So that's not too hard. What we can do is go back to our main.js. So when we stop it, change the text content of this toggle button to start. And over here, we want to change it back to stop. So now let's try it out. So when we start, the text changes to stop. And when you press stop, it'll go back to start. Reset works. And okay, cool. So there's just one other thing we need to fix. We don't want to be able to reset the time while the timer is running. We only want it to happen when it's already stopped. So this is also an easy fix. In our reset function, we'll just say, do this only if the timer isn't on. So we can say if this is not on, if this isn't on, then do this code and move that into the if block. Okay, now let's try it out. So this is what it should look like. Try it out. So now reset button won't work, but if we stop it, then we can reset it. And good. So this is the finished stopwatch. Hopefully you were able to learn something from that. I hope it didn't go too fast. So one improvement we can do is over here. So instead of having this long if-else block, what we can do is have two functions, one for starting watch. We'll just call it function start and function stop. So the stop function is going to run this code, and the start function is going to run this code. Let me fix the indentation. So we can get rid of this now. And what we can say is we can use the ternary operator here, which is like a shorter version, more concise way of writing if-else. So we can say, is the watch on? If it is, then stop it. Otherwise, start it. And this should still do the same thing. So as you can see, it still works. And our code looks a bit neater. So that's pretty much the tutorial. So a couple of things you can maybe improve on your own. Instead of using this passing in an element, maybe take in the whole object's options. And then over here, instead of passing in the element, we can pass in an object, and you can pass in a bunch of options maybe. So we can say element, timer, and then the delay, and 10. So instead of hard coding this 10 in the update, maybe use delay instead. And then over here we can say var lm equals ops.lm and var delay equals ops.delay. So this gives the user more customizability when they create their watch, so maybe they can change it to 100. So instead of going really fast, it'll kind of make the delay a bit slower. They can use 10, or they can even use 1. Let's see what happens when they use 1. So it'll go pretty fast. It'll keep updating this a lot faster. And yeah, so mess around with it, make it better. I'll be posting this code on GitHub, and I'll share the link in the description. So hopefully you guys enjoy that. Let me know what you guys think, and feel free to comment and ask questions. So thanks for watching.